It's not often as a scientist you wish you hadn't looked into something. Quite a few years ago now, I was part of a special scientific expedition to False Bay, South Africa. You might have heard a lot about it on Shark Week, because this spot, it's infamous for being among the most shark-infested waters on Earth. Great whites turn out in their hundreds to prey on the thousands of Cape Fur seals that call the aptly named Seal Island home. As a marine biologist, I had always dreamed of working with the sharks of False Bay. So you can imagine how excited I was when I originally got the call. One of my colleagues, a guy I went through college with all the way to our respective PhDs, had been handed what he called a fascinating, if slightly unusual, assignment, and he personally sought me out as one of the research scientists. Even without a lot of details, I jumped at the chance. Sharks were hardly my specialty, but False Bay is such an iconic place that I wasn't worried in the slightest. I was sure I'd accept no matter what. I flew into Cape Town on a miserable winter's morning. The sky was full of fat, angry grey clouds, and out the window of the plane I could see the countless white flecks on the surface of the sea as harsh winds stripped the top off the swell. Callum, or more officially, Dr. Callum Short, the man who had recruited me, met me as I struggled off the red-eye surface. He looked restless and eager as we shook hands. "I'm so glad you said yes, mate. It's going to be unreal working together again." I grinned, despite being bone-achingly tired. Callum always had that infectious personality about him. Well, when a bloke who spends most of his time wrangling monster sharks gives me a call for a hand, I find it hard to refuse. He gave me a knowing smile. "Well, we might not be wrangling many sharks on this trip, but I think we'll make up for it. Come on, we're going straight to the boat. I'll tell you all about it when we get there." "Yeah, fine, but first I need a monster coffee." It was a reasonably short trip to the docks. Lightning, in fact, compared to the red eye from Perth to Joburg. I was surprised when we were hurried on board. The vessel was already idling, ready to head out. I'd thought it would be too late in the morning for the sharks to be active. I was not so surprised, though, to discover that 6 of the 8 scientists on board were women. Callum had always preferred to work with women, to the point that it had earned him an unfair reputation as a bit of a philanderer. The truth was that Callum had been burned by less than ethical research partners in the past, and had come to believe that men would eventually care more about competition than collaboration. Or, as he so eloquently put it one night in a Townsville pub, it just inevitably devolves into a fight over who has the biggest, swingiest dick. I mean, he wasn't wrong. We gathered in the conference room of the spacious vessel, and I learned the names of everyone else. The 5 women were Cassie, an ecologist, Maria and Helen, shark biologists, Janice, a zoologist, and Callum's PhD student, Claire. The only other bloke was an oceanographer named Kevin. Callum rejoined us as the small talk started to fade out. Please, sit down. It's gonna get rough when we get out into the teeth of the wind." As if on cue, a freezing gust buffeted the ship, and I clutched at a chair for support. He laughed. "I see you've all met Alan, our resident deep-sea evolutionary biologist. Obviously, I don't have to explain the history of this place to any of you. Only 2 other known sites match this one in terms of white shark aggregation: the Neptune Islands and the waters around Guadalupe. It's been the crucible of white shark science for decades, and we're still learning." He paused, shuffling through a thick pile of papers. "Last year we began to notice something odd about the white sharks in the area. Normally the sharks here are relatively transient. They come in and out of the bay and track along the coast and out to sea in the meantime. Individual animals don't actually spend more than a few days within the bay itself. But 4 or 5 times a year, the sharks push right into the bay. They stop going out to sea and they spend a good week or more in the shallow waters along the coast. In that week or two, we don't see the sharks more often, but as we've started tracking more and more of them, we've realised that the number of sharks in the bay might be as high as 3 times the norm for this period. We're here to work out why." He cleared his throat before continuing. "This is unusual behaviour, and obviously it has local authorities concerned. Like it or not, great white sharks are apex predators, and an unpredictable influx of equally unpredictable sharks in an area where they are comfortable and feed often is still cause for concern. An increase in human-shark interactions means the potential for disaster is much higher, and that's not good for the people or for the sharks." He surveyed the attentive faces around the table. 2 days ago, the sharks spontaneously pushed right into the bay again. We estimate we've probably got anywhere from 7 days to a fortnight before everything goes back to normal. So, our remit, if you will, is to work out why the sharks behave this way and whether we can predict it so that appropriate safety measures can be taken. Sharks are part of life here, so if adaptations need to be made because of this behaviour, then the authorities need to be put in a position where they understand the issues. We've already eliminated the obvious. This behaviour seems random, with no clear link to any one trigger. That's why we've had to expand our team the way we have." The others immediately bombarded Callum with questions, but I tuned them out. I could already tell most of what they were asking was about the obvious. Callum was very thorough, although prone to narrowing his focus and missing the bigger picture at times. And as I thought it through, it seemed like he had missed something big after all. Conversation hit a lull. We're all just talking about the sharks. Why? There's a lot more than just sharks out there. What are the other animals doing when the sharks behave this way? Callum looked at me, the corners of his eyes crinkling imperceptibly. "I actually don't know. What are you getting at?" Of course, he knew the answer already, but not everyone in the room was as sharp. Well, sharks aren't the only large animal in the bay, are they? There's the seals who head offshore to feed. So do the penguins. I'm not sure about the bay itself, but we're also within the habitual range of a few different dolphins. Then there's the transients. Orcas are found in the area, as well as other whale species. Seems to me they're just as relevant as the sharks in all of this. Orcas prey on great white sharks, penguins, seals and dolphins, so their behaviour certainly seems relevant. Callum smirked, more in a self-deprecating way than anything else. "That would have probably been a good place to start, eh? I'll get in touch with a few other researchers, see if their data sheds any light. There's a lot fewer tracking devices on those animals than on sharks though, so it might turn out to be useless. We're making for Seal Island now, mostly because it's a focal point and we can monitor the tags a lot easier from there. Feel free to wander the ship a bit, familiarise yourselves with it. We might be here a good week or so." The others took the opportunity to wander out in small groups, but I stayed behind with Callum and Claire. Something was bugging me. I was an evolutionary biologist. Well, evolutionary ecologist to be technical. Just as I'd been introduced. but I specialised in water dozens of times deeper than False Bay. I knew enough, but I was, quite literally, out of my depth. Callum just told me that he wanted me on the team because I was a good scientist, but I felt like he was holding something back. By this point, however, I was absolutely exhausted, so I just went to bed. We spent a few days just gathering data. The tags Callum had been fitting to the sharks were pretty remarkable, able to transmit a signal to a receiver on board the boat that determined a precise direction, depth, and distance and then plotted it to a map. No more holding TV aerials and chasing the beeps around like maddened geese. It became clear that the sharks were definitely holding in the bay, and when the other data came in along with it, it seemed like other animals were doing the same. Seals, penguins, dolphins, all penned in the bay as though trapped by some unseen force. The only thing we had no data on was the orcas, so we originally thought that maybe they were the culprits. That was quickly scrapped though when we heard from a few fishermen that they hadn't seen a single fin for over a week. The orcas had gone. So what the hell was going on? I'd been doing this a while at this stage, and all this data was giving me an uncomfortable feeling in my gut. Science may pride itself on rationality, but instinct still rules at the end of the day. And my instinct was telling me that this wasn't right. Animals only scattered like this when there was a problem. Large animals, especially apex predators, very rarely had problems. Anyway, it seemed like the only way we were going to get answers was to head offshore. The weather wasn't great, but it wasn't dangerous either. We churned a search pattern through the heaving seas a few k's offshore, looking at everything we could. We were looking for tags on the acoustic receiver, and we found none. There were no sharks out here. We had the crew keeping an eye out for orcas, and they saw absolutely nothing. We took the water temperature as we went. We tested it for all sorts of contaminants, but everything came up normal, and the knot in my stomach grew tighter and tighter. This was a classic rich spot, two currents meeting to drive huge biodiversity. So why was it seemingly dead? I think it was day 5 or 6 when I first noticed it. I was going over some tapes in the lab with Cassie when I heard the faintest sound that didn't quite fit. A rapid-fire clicking. I thought I imagined it at first, but when I asked Cassie to take a listen, she heard it too. It was, just like I said, very faint, but it was unmistakably a coda. For the uninitiated, a coda is an indicator of echolocation on a massive scale. It's a common myth that all whales use sonar or echolocation to supplement their senses. Only toothed whales can use this kind of sonar, and only the largest of them can produce a coda. Sperm whales have that massive, squared-off head because it's dedicated entirely to echolocation. Their head is filled with oil, which is why they were so prized by whalers. And at the top of their skull is a structure that looks like a satellite dish. This basically amplifies the rapid-fire clicks required for echolocation to a ludicrous scale. A large bull sperm whale can produce a coda of over 200 decibels, louder than a jet engine, and at the wrong range, loud enough to rupture a human eardrum. It's used not only to see in the inky black world of the abyssal sea when they hunt, but I'd been working on a theory that they used it to disorient their prey. If there were sperm whales around, maybe that would help narrow down what we were looking for, or cross some things off the list at least. After some debate, we resolved to find them. The acoustic receiver we used for the tags was able to give us a rough location, pointing us to an area where the continental shelf is scarred by a series of deep ravines snaking their way up from the abyssal plain. This made sense to me. Sperm whales hunt squid, and places where there are trenches and canyons give them a bottleneck in which to hunt. I wish I'd never heard that godforsaken coda. I wish I didn't know what I know now. It's a tough story to tell, but it needs to be told. The deeper water we were heading for was about 20 kilometers offshore. An easy stint for our vessel even in moderate seas. The hydrophones kept picking up the coda, rhythmic and regular. It increased in volume as we got closer too, which is when I realized that something was very wrong. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they were just too wrapped up in their own samples and studies and whatever to take notice. There's a lot of boring stuff I've left out. How one scientist had a theory about algal blooms and another was working on something about sonar pollution, among other ideas. There were a lot of different tangents, but as an ecologist, I hadn't really had a lot to do yet, so I was paying close attention to the hydrophones. I began to realize that the coda never changed. It was precisely the same pattern every single time. Sperm whales do not do that. Each whale has an individual signature, and it makes a huge number of different sounds, depending on the purpose of that sound. Whatever we were heading towards was not a sperm whale. The knot in my stomach tightened again, to the point of physical pain. My gut instinct telling me that nothing about this situation was right. Vast numbers of animals do not just vacate an area for no reason, and a mysterious sound popping up at the same time was too much to be a coincidence. I pulled Callum aside and I tried to voice my fears, but he shook them off. "This is bigger than the sharks. Everything's gone, Alan. We need to work this out. I trust your instincts, but we could be onto something big here." Well, he was right, of course, but I wish he hadn't been. As we got within a click or so of the canyons, and the very first signs of the edge of the drop started to appear on the sounder, the coda we were tracking simply stopped. It was bizarre. This thing had been sounding off for days, and it just stopped as soon as we got close. I couldn't understand it. While everyone was focused on shoehorning their own theories into what we were doing all the way out here, I sat in the quiet conference room and just thought about it. Honestly, it took far too long for it to hit me. We were blasting sonar into the water, working out topography and currents and whatever else. Sonar-producing animals are incredibly sensitive to sonar by virtue of the organs they use to detect it. Our sounders must have spooked whatever was making the noises, caused it to go quiet or even leave the area. I have to admit, I relaxed a bit then. although I couldn't shake the feeling I was missing something. I went to bed earlier than the others. It was a restless, uneasy night for me. Have you ever tried to sleep when your brain is all wound up, trying to work out whatever it is that you can't quite recall? I was tossing and turning, half awake, when I heard that coda kick off again. Only this time, it wasn't on a tape, but reverberating all around me. And suddenly, horribly, the pieces floating around my brain finally clicked into place. A coda like that, repeated ad nauseum in exactly the same pattern and at exactly the same frequency, would be near enough to useless for echolocation. It would interfere with itself, blocking out any image coming back. In fact, the only thing it would be useful for is broadcasting. That was why the sharks and the orcas and everything else had pushed out of the deep water. They might not all be able to understand the sound, but they could still hear it. To them, the tone was painful, too strong to be anything but maddening. But to the largest creatures, the ones who could properly process the information and who communicated at high volume themselves, it would be a curiosity. A sound repeated over and over in something equating to their own language. That would be well worth investigating. It was a lure. I had thrown myself out of bed and started racing towards the lab area, completely disregarding my disheveled, half-dressed state, when I noticed that the clicks were getting louder. I barged in on Callum, still awake and frantically checking instruments. He barely started as I flew through the door. "What the hell's this, Alan?" I didn't answer for a second, my eyes flicking towards the screen that was taking the sounder feed. My blood ran cold. "It's a fucking lure, Cal. Look." On the screen, a gargantuan shape was rising under the vessel. It had no actual form on the sounder, which was only meant to show depth and bottom features, simply looking like a massive blob lifting itself off the ocean floor several kilometers below. Callum stared, clearly at a loss to what he was seeing. "What? It's huge. Is it a super pod of whales? Why is it so loud? What the fuck's happening?" I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. "It's something else, Cal. I should have seen it earlier. The sound was all wrong. It's not echolocation, mate. This is why the sharks push inshore. They're hiding." A look of horror crossed his face as he realized what I was saying. He immediately grabbed the phone that connected us to the bridge. "Get us out of here, now." The ship was powered up, held in position by directional thrusters, so I just prayed that it wouldn't be too long before we got underway. It was clear that whatever was lurking down in the dark canyon wanted to at least get a closer look at us. Or worse, had already mistaken us for prey. On the sounder, it easily looked big enough to capsize this ship. I had barely a second to register just how fast this thing was rising. Jesus, it was already 2/3 of the way to the surface. But just then, the sound changed. Instead of a loud, repetitive coda, it became a ghastly shrieking, far louder than I could bear. I fell to the floor, hands clamped over my ears, my vision swimming and my mind fracturing. I was vaguely aware of some of the glass equipment in the room shattering explosively under the onslaught. Callum, good old quick-thinking Cal, was at my side a few seconds later. He'd grabbed two of the pairs of noise-cancelling headphones that were sitting right on the benchtop, and he shoved a pair over my ears. It wasn't really the intended purpose, but they did the job. He was pointing to the door that led to the staircase up to the main deck. As more glass went off and peppered my arms, I understood we needed to get somewhere less fragile than the lab. We reached the deck, the cold air hitting me like an actual impact. I was still barely dressed. Callum led the way into the relative shelter of the aft common room, where the large windows were reinforced enough to deal with ice impact and massive swells. The sound was immense. We were under physical assault. I could feel it crashing through me. Out the window, I could see the wake of the ship just starting to stretch out behind us. I registered, fleetingly, that we were at least on our way out of the area. Then, the wall of sound brought me to my knees. I couldn't see how far away it was, because I had lost all sense of these things by now. But some distance behind the ship, I saw the surface of the water break. Whatever had been under us was now on the surface. It came up like a submarine in breach, obliterating the ocean's surface in a vast mass of white foam. It was far too dark to make out any details, but the moon and the light of the ship itself gleamed off too much dark, slick skin for me to even process. That shrieking wall of noise ratcheted up a few more octaves. My body finally gave out at this increased assault, and my brain shut down, sweeping me into unconsciousness. I woke up to a naval officer gently checking my vital signs. The sun was out, but I was disoriented and began to thrash around, overcome by the panic I felt before I blacked out. I only remembered snatches of time for a little bit. Being restrained by the officers, being stretchered on board their vessel, glimpses of faces here and there. I think I truly came to my senses a couple of days later, lying in a hospital. I had the most awful ringing in my ears, and one of my eardrums had ruptured. But apart from shock and a few minor traumatic effects, I was deemed okay. Callum, too, had a reasonably clean bill of health. There were 12 other survivors, including the crew members who made it. Of our colleagues, only Cassie and Claire lived through the attack, along with 8 of the crew. I didn't look into how the others died exactly. I didn't want to know. It turned out our captain had been quick enough on his feet to send a distress signal as he ordered the vessel pointed towards shore at full bore. He was one of the survivors, and we owe him our lives for both of those acts. Even when he blacked out, both eardrums shattered and bleeding from the eyes. The ship chugged on, oblivious to the things that affected its fleshy cargo. The Navy found us later the next afternoon, and the survivors were airlifted back to Cape Town. They made up some ridiculous cover story, but I was too shell-shocked to even care. Cal left his work in South Africa, returning to Australia and becoming utterly obsessed with the depths. He wanted to know what happened that night, miles off False Bay, so desperately that he's ruined his career in the pursuit. We've only spoken once since the incident. About a week after it happened, he came to see me in my hotel. I was about to fly home, and he wanted to tell me about his plans. We had a brief chat, both of us still suffering the psychological echoes of our experience. I told him what I saw, and he seemed torn between thinking it was a hallucination and believing me. I can't say I blame him. I wonder the same thing myself all the time. He wondered why and how the thing had attacked us, and my incoherent thoughts from the ship's common area came flooding back. "Stunning," I said, and he frowned. "I've been working on the theory that sperm whales can use their sonar to stun or disorient their prey, not just to see. I think it fits here. Whatever that thing was, it lured us in with the imitation whale coda, and then, when we were in range, it blasted us with sound. It was springing a trap. Maybe it thought we were a whale." We've not spoken since. As for me, it took me over a year to get back into the water. I worked as a lecturer for a bit, keeping my feet firmly planted on solid ground. But the seas always called to me. This kind of work is a part of me, and it was inevitable that I would find my way back eventually. I have to admit, I was terrified on that first dive. Instinct took over quickly enough though, and shortly, I was back to full and active research. That was several years ago, and my work was as rewarding and straightforward as it ever was before Seal Island. Until a month ago anyway. See, last month, I was running a routine dive out of Perth, mostly to calibrate some new research instruments. We were running through a canyon that lies about 20 kilometers off Rottnest Island. I was chatting with my partner on the dive. Boring stuff. When I found myself trailing off, ice filling my veins. Over the small talk and the sound of the sub-engines, I heard the unmistakable sound of a short coda, repeating in bursts that were far too regular for echolocation. Hearing that sound again, that hellish oral lure, shook me to the core. It's been years since that night off the coast of South Africa, but I was instantly back there, glass shattering as my colleagues died around me. The first thing I did was get the hell out of that canyon, but the very next thing I did was to call Callum. It's fair to say that South Africa broke Callum. I know he blamed himself, despite the fact that none of us could have ever had any idea what was down there. Cal took it hard, retreated from the world, dropped his scientific pursuits, and started focusing on nothing but that beast. He wanted to find out what it was so badly that he sank all his money into the chase. Most of the colleagues who had once admired him now shunned him entirely, called him crazy. Maybe he was a bit too, but I could hardly blame him. He was no less brilliant for it, and I knew he'd been chasing this thing obsessively for years, so he seemed the logical choice to contact. Callum was in Brisbane, a week or so away from heading out on another expedition. When he heard what I had to say, though, he shelved it, and he made plans to come to Perth as soon as he could. That night, he sent me an email. "Alan, I need to tell you a story before I come out there, because I haven't got many allies anymore. Not after what happened. But I need closure. I need to find out what's out there, and I'm willing to take the rest of my life to bring it to light. And I know you understand that, even if you disagree with my approach. I only ever found bits and pieces. Some murky audio on a Sosis mic, or stories that might be tangentially related. I have so many faint, barely audible shrieks that sound completely alien, but must have been recorded from 1,000 miles away. Once we got called out to a beach where half a sperm whale carcass washed up. The thing was shredded, but it was badly decomposed, and apart from the fact that the spine had been severed by something, we couldn't get anything concrete. Last year, though, someone found a large shark longliner drifting somewhere south of New Caledonia. A handful of the crew were missing, and those left on board were all dead. It was pretty hush-hush. I think mostly because it was an illegal boat, but also because of all the bodies. They said it was not pretty. The poor bastards must have got a full blast. I'll spare you the gory details, but suffice to say that one of the things their injuries were consistent with was sonic trauma. This had to be sonic trauma on a massive scale, though. Worse than what we went through, even. Some of the guys died in reasonably open areas. They reckon 190 decibels is enough to burst most people's eardrums, and 240 or thereabouts would be fatal 100% of the time in an enclosed space. I can only imagine how horrible that blast had to be to kill those men up on deck. We were never allowed to see the boat or the bodies, but that probably doesn't matter. I'm not exactly qualified to make much of whatever I would find anyway. We did manage to find out that the ship had stopped in Vanuatu, so we knew that to get where it was found, it had to cross the New Hebrides Trench. That was worrying, because as you know, there's an awful lot of cruise ship traffic going back and forth over certain parts of that trench. It gave us somewhere to look, though. We'd been back to South Africa a few times and found nothing major. Although we did get a bit more audio, it was much further away. Given the range of potential recordings, I figure these things probably move around in the much deeper waters, coming up into shallower spots to feed, or when their path dictates. They can pretty much cross the whole ocean without ever leaving the abyssal zone. I'm sure you can imagine that I haven't got a lot of serious scientific backing on this. Which is to say, I have zero backing. But you'd be amazed at the kind of help you can get from other sources. I've been working with a couple of cryptozoologists, which is an interesting experience. Although they have actually studied biology, so they do know what they're talking about for the most part. Money takes care of the rest. People will do just about anything for the right amount of dollars. We haven't got top-of-the-line tech, but it's still better than the stuff we were working with out when we first started out. New Hebrides isn't far offshore, really. In real terms, it runs about 50 k's off Port Vila and 20 k's off Mare Island. So, access wasn't a problem. We even got a half-decent ship for the mission. A bit older, sure, but solid as a rock, and bigger than I expected. It was based out of Numau, which meant a slightly longer trip to the trench. But I figured we'd just go south-north instead of north-south for the survey. The idea was we'd run a lawnmower survey pattern across the width of the trench with the mapping sounder, as well as hydrophones, and then dive down anywhere that seemed promising. We had a couple of tow cameras, but they had a very limited field of view. I wanted an ROV if I'm being totally honest, but all I could get was a salvage sub, so it would have to be manned dives. I didn't really think a sub would be big enough to interest these things, but I also knew that sitting in a thick metal sphere, we were just dead if we got caught in a blast. At close range, I don't think even a bathysphere would block enough out to save us. We were never going to be able to survey the whole trench, of course, but we knew that the longliners had encountered the thing somewhere north of New Caledonia anyway, and I thought that was the best place to look. The trench bends toward Fiji as it passes New Caledonia, so we steamed almost due east from Numau, and we intercepted it at the curve. I wanted to spend a little time just listening, so we hung around quietly for a full day, and with the hydrophones out. That first sperm whale coda got me sweating. I was terrified, but it quickly became clear that it was just a pod of whales. They were close too, popping up from one of their hunts within maybe a kilometre of the boat, just relaxing for an hour or so, even giving us some nice big signatures on the sonar as they swam underneath us. It was good because we got a good range of sounds from them to compare to the lure, if we heard it. They'd also clearly been hunting, which was good because whilst I still don't really know much about what the thing we're after feeds on, I know that lure is tailored to sperm whales, and I'm near enough to certain that whale carcass had been torn in half by one. So, an area where the whales are feeding is likely to attract them. Either they feed on the whales, or they feed on the big squid that the whales are feeding on, or maybe a bit of both. Our whales looked quite relaxed though, so we decided that we'd start a slow search pattern, moving north in the direction the longliner would have drifted from. I was a bit leery about using the sonar at first. I remembered how the one in the Southern Ocean reacted, and I can't help but wonder if our sonar is part of what caused it to attack. Maybe if we'd just been sailing over the top without making any noise, everyone would still be alive. I don't know. But we definitely needed to see what was happening down there as best we could, and I knew that if it moved through the trench below us, we'd be able to see it on the sounder. I also decided to tow the cameras. There was obviously a huge risk of losing them, just because of the sheer length of cable needed to reach a useful depth. But I couldn't just stare at a glorified fish finder all day and night, and I was excited about the trench. It's not one that's been heavily explored, so even with a poor field of view, I thought we could potentially see some groundbreaking stuff. We did see some awesome stuff too. Lots of cusk eels, but also squid and octopus. and an absolute myriad of different jellies and shrimp. We even got a fang tooth and a viper fish, which was just brilliant. The amount of life down there was staggering, but we weren't seeing any signs of what we were actually looking for until we were pretty much halfway up the trench from where we started. Out of the blue, we got something strange on the sounder. It didn't look like a living thing, but something seemed to be blocking a shallower part of the trench. The cameras proved useless here. We couldn't tow them accurately enough to get an idea of what we were looking at. So down we went. Look, I've done a few deep dives in my time. Nowhere near as many as you, but a few. That dive was the longest dive of my life. The descent was an abysmal experience. I basically spent the entire time entirely resigned to death, wondering when I was going to see a gigantic eye open out of the porthole and be blasted into oblivion by some wall of sound. I don't even know if these things have eyes, but I couldn't shake that image. Eventually, we reached the bottom, and we started looking around. Although, the decision to turn on the lights was another very tough one. It was pretty clear that what we'd seen on the sounder was a rock fall. The western wall of the trench coming off the basin where it goes through a series of short drops had partly collapsed. It clearly wasn't an immediately recent fall, but it wasn't very old either. We were swinging around, light plying over the wall to the other side of the rubble, when it caught something that made both myself and the co-pilot gasp. Running for maybe 150 meters or so down the wall were 6 parallel lines gouged into the rock, maybe 3 feet apart. I don't want to say what it looked like, but I think I have to, don't I? Claws. We poked around for a bit longer, but suddenly we were buffeted by a strong current coming from the north. Through the radio, someone shouted at us to turn the lights off and get out of there. My heart was immediately in my throat. We were looking for a giant, killer monster at the bottom of the ocean in a tiny steel coffin. It was a fair bet that whatever the surface guys were seeing was not good news for us. I immediately made a beeline for the surface, but you know how long it takes to come up from that sort of dive. And we were in an older sub. It felt like 100 years, even if the guy's topside did calm down a bit once we broke away from the bottom. When we were back on board, I raced into the ops room to see what had happened. The cameras didn't pick anything up. Visibility's limited down there anyway, and we were looking at the wall the whole time. But the sonar showed a huge shape appearing almost out of nowhere, just a few 100 meters to the north, and moving further up the trench. This one looked even bigger than the one off Faults Bay, and we'd been maybe 300 or 400 meters away without ever even knowing it. That fucking shook me. I spent the night mindlessly staring at the sounder output, completely unable to sleep, telling myself that we'd call it all off and go home in the morning. Sometime during the night, I decided to check the hydrophones, and I heard it. Identical to the last one. A coda, repeating exactly the same way at exactly the same rate. It was close too. Not directly under us, but within a few kilometers. Honestly, at that stage, part of me wanted to just go home more than ever. Just buy a house miles from the ocean and stay there forever. Never even look at the water again. But the part of me that needs to know was stronger. I was closer than I'd been since the original incident. There was no way I could walk away now. We couldn't dive the next day. The sub had taken a buffeting, and even though we never actually hit anything, I wanted to make sure it was all in working order. That damn lure just kept repeating incessantly, like it was toying with me. I was recording it though, so that was at least useful data to lock away with all the other circumstantial evidence I've got hidden for the big reveal, whenever I get there. I couldn't help but keep an eye on the sonar when I was in the ops room, but it didn't seem like the thing was moving. It seems like that's their MO. They're happy to move around within the environment, but their hunting strategy, or at least their hunting strategy for targeting sperm whales, is an ambush. Get them within striking distance, and then blast them with the sonic taser. They must move up into shallower water to hunt them though. No way sperm whales are diving 7 k's down. And it definitely seemed like this coda was coming from higher in the water column. The top of the trench walls were easily within range of a diving whale at this point. So, I figured it must have been sitting on the drop, waiting. We ran the search pattern overnight, trying to find a more precise location. Interestingly, the sonar didn't show anything unusual, so I had to literally play it by ear. After a certain point, the strength of the coda started to fade, so we figured we must have passed over the thing. Working back, we plotted a rough location and we got ready for the dive. I didn't want to go down there. I really didn't want to go down there. But I'd spent years chasing ghosts, and the chance for something concrete was only a few thousand meters away. I had to go down and see where it leads. We reached the bottom a lot faster, given that we weren't dropping down to the trench floor. It was still deep enough that there was no light. I didn't think it was a good idea to turn the lights on again though, so I'd taken off one of the cameras and put in a red light version. Obviously, red light is invisible that far down, so hopefully we wouldn't be seen. I probably should have done that originally, but hindsight's always 20/20. It meant that we were almost blind, apart from the screen which enhanced the low light. So I was kinda glad I hadn't relied on it to navigate the rockfall anyway. When we finally bottomed out at the edge of the trench, I knew instantly we must have been close. The lure was resounding all around us, loud enough to put our teeth on edge. This was very different to South Africa. Not only because we were in the water with this thing, but because we'd been using our own sonar the whole time, and it showed absolutely no reaction. I still wonder what that means about their behaviour. Did this one spend a lot of time in the area, where ships pass over all the time? Did we spook the other one? Or was it more aggressive than this one? Was it younger, less experienced? I still know absolutely nothing about them. Don't get me wrong, I was obscenely glad that this one wasn't reacting the same way, but the scientist in me was tossing up theories at 1,000,000 miles an hour. We had quite a lot of bottom time at that depth, which I suppose is one advantage of a salvage sub over a research one, built for longer stint on the bottom. We crept around slowly, scanning for any sign of a giant monster, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing but mud. We could still hear that lure, maddeningly loud, even with protection, almost taunting us. But there was no sign anything was out of the ordinary. The faint red light illuminated an empty sea, the black abyss nibbling at the edges of our tiny little island of illumination. I was on that edge when I first saw it. I don't know, even now, if it was the thing, or some part of it, or if it was something completely unrelated. But in the gloom, just barely visible on the very edge of the light, I saw movement. Something big too. Small things move quickly, always looking out for trouble. Bigger things move slower, more confidently. Whatever I saw was just passing by the sub. Like I said, I don't know if it was even related, but I know beyond a doubt that what happened next was the sub stopped dead. I don't mean we lost power, or we got fouled on structure. There was nothing around us. Just the flat wasteland of the basin and the drop-off into the trench off to the right. This was a reasonably big sub too, not one of those research ones that fit in the average living room. But we were going nowhere. Then slowly, almost delicately, we began to move towards the edge of the trench. Whatever had us, it was dragging us down. Panic's an understatement. I figured if we went over that drop, we were dead. I don't know why I felt that so strongly. Maybe it was just the panic. Or maybe I knew that we were in the grip of something that could probably crush us like a sardine tin and could absolutely liquefy our brains with sound. I guessed it probably didn't know what we were at that point, but that it wouldn't be gentle for too long. My co-pilot was a retired salvage driver with about 6 hours in a sub and the rest in training, so he was absolutely no help. I can't blame the guy. I tried gently goosing the engines, trying to break the grip of whatever horrific appendage had control of this thing, but it was no use. All the equipment was pinned. As the edge of the chasm approached, I played my last hand. I flicked on all the floodlights. Boy, did that get a response. There was a god-awful screech, and suddenly we were tumbling violently through a cloud of silt, like whatever had had hold of us had recoiled in fright. As we tumbled through the silt, I saw the faintest glimpse of something dark and linear, swinging by awfully close to the sub. It was easily big enough to rock us again, sending us careening off in yet another direction. At some stage, I smacked my head, which dazed me, but I still had the sense to flick the emergency ascent switch. I couldn't tell up from down, and there was no way the silt was going to clear quickly enough. Plus, I had no idea how bad the damage to the sub was. I just prayed that the systems were still in working order. Beyond that, there was nothing I could do but wait. The thoughts of giant eyes and a shrieking death were with me the whole way up. Thankfully, we made it to the surface. Barely. We stopped maybe 5 meters below actually, but the recovery equipment managed okay, and we made it back on board with just some cuts and bruises. I'm pretty sure my co-pilot is never going to go back near the water again, but we were theoretically fine. We had to head back to Namau though. The sub wasn't in any state to dive again, and there was no way we were going to be able to fix it at sea. I can't say I was all that upset on balance. I was a little annoyed that I'd finally got close to one of these things again and still come away with nothing concrete. But I was fried, and I just needed to take some time. I flew to Fiji not long after we made landfall, and just sat in a dodgy resort and contemplated everything. I think that thing was sitting on the wall of the trench. That's why we never saw it, and why it was dragging us back down there. That also could be why we never saw it on the sonar until it moved. It was clinging to the wall, using the depth of the trench to hide itself. I think that this one was larger than the one we encountered originally too. The scale of it moving on the sonar struck me. I've been over the tapes, and it's hard to make out a lot, but the signature seems to be at least 3 times the size of the echo we got off some of those whales we saw early on. 1 or 2 of those were big bulls, 20 meters long and 50 tons or more. You ramp that up 3 times, and you're looking at something creeping around the bottom of the ocean that's comparable to a blue whale, and properly predatory. After the first time, with only the sonar images to go off, I got the impression of a big solid mass. This time, I got the impression of something quite long and powerful. And fast. This thing shot off the sonar at unbelievable speed when I flicked those lights on. Obviously, the way it's oriented towards the sounder changes the signature, but I think the longer image is probably a better guess. I had to send you this before I came out, because I need you to be prepared for what we might face if we do run into another one of these things. It could be so much worse than what we went through in South Africa. I'm not sure if the one we came across in the trench was the same one that killed the longliners, but even if it is, then it can generate an even deadlier sonic wave and might be twice the size. If it wasn't, then maybe there are even bigger examples out there. I've managed to get a flight out there in 2 days. I'll text you the details. I'm going out to the canyon, Alan, and I hope you'll come with me. But I needed to tell you all this so you can make the most informed decision. These things, whatever they are not to be taken lightly. I reread Callum's story 4 or 5 times, horrified. To think that he was that close to one of these things gave me a lasting chill. To think that we might have only encountered a relatively small one. Well, I didn't really want to even think about that. I had to think long and hard about what I wanted to do. In the end, though, it wasn't really a choice. These things were out there, whether I went looking for them or not. And sitting at home on dry land wasn't going to change that. I made a few calls, half making up a story about picking up an interesting acoustic signature, and this being the perfect time to test some of the gear on one of the ROVs. and putting together a few people who wouldn't balk at what I was planning. Callum would arrive in 2 days. We would set sail in 3. The morning we set off, I felt like the weather was taunting us. A clear, hot summer's day was in full swing as we arrived at the docks in Fremantle, in stark contrast to the sick storm settling in my stomach. Callum obviously felt the same, judging from the way the corners of his eyes pinched and his lips pressed into a thin line. This airport pickup had been very different from the one all those years ago in Cape Town. Warmth and happiness replaced by uncertainty and distance. It was good to see him, but it was so damn hard. Gone was the cocky, brilliant bloke I grew up with as our careers evolved. He looked haggard and spent, a shell of the person he had been. This trip, I was running a skeleton crew. I pushed for it to be that way, because, ostensibly, we were just testing the equipment whilst I looked for something interesting I'd heard. Which was more of a criminally oversimplified statement than an outright lie. The horror we endured the last time we ran into one of these things certainly played a lot more of a part in that decision. If we were sailing straight into the teeth of the beast, so to speak, I didn't want to be putting more lives at risk than necessary. We were to be heading some 100 kilometers from Fremantle, out to one of my favourite sites. As we set out, Callum and I sat down with my research partner, Lucy, and we discussed what little we knew about the things. Lucy and her PhD student Ryan both believed that there had to be a known explanation for everything that had happened, and both tried to rebut our theories. It was pretty hard to rebut all the bodies though. At some stage during our discussion, it became clear that we still knew absolutely nothing about what we were looking for. We didn't even have a name for the things yet. Callum, who had spent so much time poring over history looking for any correlation, decided to call them aspids. The aspidoshalon, he explained, was a monstrous creature that was said to rise from the deepest oceans and destroy ships. In many legends, it employed a lure to attract prey and roared with the voice of a god. Of course, it was also supposed to be the size of a nation and carry an island on its back, but fishermen love a tall tale. I doubt these things have anything to do with the original myth, but we know they use lures, and you could certainly say they have a voice of a god. I couldn't help but think it more appropriate to say they had the voice of a demon. Aspid did seem fitting though, so it stuck. This was to be a very different expedition. Callum had tried to get down and see our quarry up close and personal, but I had other ideas. Clearly, the aspids used sound in a highly specialised way, and I hoped to use that in our favour. Armed with recordings of the aspid coda, the best quality unidentified shriek Callum could clean up, and the imperfect recordings he took in the New Hebrides trench, we planned to constantly pump noise into the water in hopes of eliciting a response. Of course, our encounter in the dead fishing vessel weighed heavily on my mind. I was gambling on the original tragedy being a rare incident, a misidentification or an aggressive individual, and I was hoping that any response from an aspid in the area would merely be a vocal one. Callum thought it was likely that the ill-fated fishing vessel got caught in a predation event, or perhaps fouled the creature in its miles of heavy-duty line and drew a reaction. That's what we were telling ourselves anyway. As the ship crossed into the sapphire blue of the deep water, Lucy found me standing by the railing. "There's really something to this, isn't there?" I must have frowned in response. "Oh no, I don't mean anything by it. It's just that, well, it all sounds so weird. We've been conditioned to think that we know more than we do, I guess." She nodded down at the ocean. "We're within sight of the coast, and the water is already so deep that human beings can spend more time in space than we do down there. It's not our world, but we're so dominant over the rest of the planet that we kind of bundle the ocean up with everything else we control. Honestly, Dr. Short has a bit of a reputation, and I can see that in his eyes. But I know you. You're still rational, and if you back his story, then I have to believe it, I think. I don't know what's down there, and I'm not sure I can fully accept a gigantic ship-killing monster. But I do believe that the official story isn't the truth either." It meant more than it maybe should have, honestly. Lucy was a great scientist, but she was very much a traditional one. She steered well clear of things she thought were too far out there, and sea monsters were definitely in that category. My research site was a place called Whale Alley. It was a small ravine that sneaked up from the southern side of the main canyon, creating an upswelling as the deep current from the west coast forced its way up the narrow chute. As Callum had found in the Pacific, the aspids were attracted to places where the deep water pushes into areas with shallow waters, and their prey could dive down into an ambush. I had to assume they preyed on other large sea creatures too. It didn't seem sustainable that they would feed solely on sperm whales, and Whale Alley was the perfect spot for big squid. It just seemed like the kind of place that things would be hanging out, if they were around. We arrived on site with a few hours of daylight left, and a flurry of activity on the deck. Callum wanted to get everything happening at once, and after a bit, I had to take him aside and tell him to cool it off for a while. There was a hint of madness in his eyes, a drive that I wasn't sure was healthy. I didn't want him creating angst between the already stretched crew. I did, however, get out the hydrophonic receivers and prep the ROV, which would be running indefinitely whilst operating on tether. All was quiet as night fell. Callum had sequestered himself in one of the labs in a huff. Ryan was having a few beers in the common area with the crew, and Lucy and I were hunkered down in the lab, listening to Callum's recordings. There were a lot of murky, far-off somethings that were completely unrecognisable. They sounded strange, but could have honestly been anything. The recordings from the sub in the Hebrides trench, though, they were downright terrifying. I had hoped I would never have to hear that awful shriek again. But there it was, high and loud, with a resonance that punched you in the chest. I was racked with shivers, even through the distortion caused by water leaking into the damaged mics when the thing grabbed the submarine. Lucy's eyes flew wide too, as the cry resounded around the lab. Holy shit! It was more than I could muster. I had to settle my racing heart and fight back tears. This sound was shorter, sharper than the sonic stunner we'd previously encountered. But it was clearly related. Even Lucy was trembling, the call still carrying enough power even trapped within a recording to shake her. I felt very small. The knowledge of the yawning ocean beneath the hull inducing a gnawing sense of thalassophobia. "Was that the sound?" asked Lucy. I shook my head, still struggling for words. No, it was much worse than that. Take that, amplify it, and have it going in 10-minute bursts, and you might come close. I rubbed the tears from my eyes. These things are lethal, Lucy. I should never have brought you out here. Lucy scoffed at this. Are you insane? This changes everything. I was on the fence here, but no animal I know of makes a sound like that. If we're out here to get evidence of a new species, and a big one, then I wouldn't miss it for the world. Hey, look. You were ambushed last time you came across one of these things. We're prepared this time, right? We're not going to get caught off again. I felt a little better at that. We weren't blundering blindly into a lethal situation. We knew what might be down there. At the same time, though, I couldn't help but wonder. Were we really prepared at all? I did not sleep well that night, still hopping with nervous energy and gripped by a sense of dread that seemed to seep through the hull from the abyss itself, coiling around my bones. Somewhere below us, cloaked in the shadows of the inky deep, I was sure death waited. I spent the night listening obsessively to the hydrophones and watching the feed from the ROV, which hovered 150 meters below us on a tether. My headphones were alive with the sounds of the ocean. Machine gun staccato of hunting sperm whales, the distant, mournful song of a lonely humpback, and the endless buzzing produced by millions of smaller things. Despite everything, it was almost soothing. A familiar drone that helped me calm down and feel a little more comfortable. After a while, I noticed something way off in the distance. It was a kind of creaking groan, almost like the call of a bowhead whale, but much deeper. In fact, I almost passed it off as a bowhead, but my subconscious nagged at me. It wasn't anything I recognized straight away, and more out of interest than anything, I clicked the record button. Slowly but surely, the sound got louder, and the threads of dread that had finally loosened their hold started to tighten again. Whatever was making this sound was big, and it was getting closer. Soon I heard a response. A second call, answering the first. Similar but slightly different in tone. I was even more inclined to think that they were bowheads then, until I realized that the other large animals had gone very quiet. The humpbacks stopped calling, and the sperm whales shut down their echolocation. Then this new sound abruptly stopped as well, and I was left with just background noise. I listened through the night, but nothing else out of the ordinary happened. Just on sunrise, I heard the sperm whales again, clearly confident enough to hunt once more, and I figured that whatever had been happening down there to hush them was over. The normal sounds of the ocean returned to their usual persistent drone. Eventually, I dozed off, despite the rapidly brightening sky. Lucy woke me around 8 a.m. with a steaming mug of coffee. We discussed the strange events of the early hours, and she frowned at the sound I had recorded. It wasn't anything conclusive, but we both agreed it was odd. For the moment, though, we had more pressing matters. Callum had started broadcasting. I considered marching out on deck and ripping shreds off him for leaping into it without consulting me, but I decided to try to be the bigger person. Callum was obsessive, and if I set him off, he'd wore me out. It sounds selfish, but I needed him until such a time as I could work on this stuff openly. Instead of blowing up, I finished my coffee and headed back to my cabin for a shower and a change of clothes. By the time I returned, Callum had joined Lucy in the audio lab. My anger had dissipated, but I was in no mood to join their conversation, so I stuck on a pair of headphones and went back to listening to the world below. Days crawled by out there on the Indian Ocean. Our calls reverberated through the water without as much as a whimper in reply, either unheard or ignored. Time became a crawl, the flat expanse of the ocean providing no respite from the tedium. 4 days passed, then 5, then 6, each one less notable than the one before it. I had hoped, theoretically, to elicit a territorial response and record a unique sound, rather than one that could be passed off as a looped recording of a sperm whale. The risk was that a territorial response would be an attack, although I did think that there would be some sort of dominance process before it came to that, as with other large animals. Of course, that hinged on the animals being territorial at all. But I had felt sure that such a large predator would be hardwired to protect its space. As it turned out, I was right. I just wasn't looking at it the right way. In the dead of the night, I wandered the deck, unable to sleep. I was leaning on the railing, staring aimlessly into the black sea, lulled by the vibrations of the ship's engines, when I suddenly jolted entirely off the rail as my brain finally caught up with my tactile senses. I looked up and down the deck, reaching out for the hull behind me tentatively, an almost comforting hum greeting my touch. Because it was the middle of the night and the sea was calm, we were running solely on the positioning thrusters. The engines were off. Something else was causing it. Something powerful enough to send a steady vibration through thousands of tons of steel. And there was only one thing I could think of capable of doing that. Every previous response had been geared towards us as outsiders. In the Pacific, Callum had twice startled the thing, clearly demonstrating to it that he was not one of its kind. Off Seal Island, the aspid we encountered had attacked us straight off the bat, and I firmly believed that that was a result of our sonar making us seem just enough like potential prey that it just took a chance. Now, though, we were trying to fool any aspids in the area into thinking that they were responding to their own kind. Yet we had gone into the whole experiment expecting the kind of response they had given us in totally different situations. I guess we were in completely unknown territory. but I felt like I should have seen that flaw in the plan earlier. We had discovered an animal with very complex sonic abilities. But the fact that it was completely unknown, despite being gigantic and capable of making sounds so loud that it killed, spoke to a subtler communication method. In the lab, I fiddled with the playback, experimenting with the frequencies until the call came through, as clear as day. An almost constant, throbbing croak, too low for our ears to hear without help. In a perverse kind of way, it sounded like an old refrigerator, but much deeper and louder. My skull rattled with each pulse, and those creeping fingers of dread squeezed my heart once again. Something about it left me in no doubt as to what this particular sound meant. It was menacing, somehow laced with aggression, even through untold cubic meters of water. A clear and obvious invitation to get the hell out of the area. After a few moments, I made the decision to turn our own broadcast off and see how the thing responded. We had clearly lured our quarry in, but I wasn't sure how long it had been agitated, and I was worried about what it might do next. Plus, I thought that if it stopped when we stopped, it would demonstrate a relationship between our broadcast and the menacing, reverberating response. The sound alone wasn't unique enough to qualify as conclusive proof, but it would back up anything else we got. Not 10 seconds after I cut the noisemakers, the low throbbing stopped entirely. I waited 5 or 6 minutes before turning the broadcast back on, and within the span of a few expectant breaths, the aberrant sound was back. I immediately shut off our broadcast again, casting a frightened glance at the sonar screen, which was, mercifully, clear of any signatures. There was still a serious sense of unease though. It might not have been in the water column underneath us, but the rapid response in the vibrating deck meant that the aspid was much, much too close. I didn't want to involve Cal yet, having seen his mental deterioration firsthand, but I decided to wake Lucy. Every fibre of my being wanted to heed that menacing warning and make a run for it, but I knew we had more to do. Lucy was bleary-eyed and grumpy at the nocturnal interruption, but I eventually coaxed her into the audio lab. Her sleepy eyes went wide as dinner plates when I played that response back, and she shivered. Jesus, Alan, what the hell is it? I've never heard anything like that. It has to be what we're here for. It must be. It's a direct response to the aspid sounds. It's huge, and it's closer than I want it to be. Let's start broadcasting again. Just the coder though, she added hastily. All those sounds coming from the same source must have been seriously off-putting, right? We don't even know the function of those shrieks. We assumed that it was a reaction to the lights when Cal startled one, but maybe that shriek is an aggressive sound. Or maybe the fact that we're sitting here broadcasting a sound of fear generates aggression towards us. The same way playing sounds of an injured lion can generate a defensive response from other lions. The code is just a lure. The response might be very different. She made a lot of sense, despite the moonlit flashes of slick, dark skin that invaded my mind and the sound of blood pounding in my ears as my heart rate spiked. I nodded, struggling to control my fear. At first, there was no response to this newly streamlined stimulus. The ocean was quiet, as we had noticed it became whenever the Aspid calls were sounding out. There was nothing but the background clamour. We sat and we waited as the hours ticked by, registering relative silence on all frequencies, until a couple of hours before sunrise. This time, there was no threat, no attack. Nothing took us by surprise. Instead, it almost seemed like a question boomed through the hushed sea. The call I had heard very early on in the expedition, the one I had mistaken for a bowhead whale, sang through our headphones, and Lucy and I jolted back to full awareness together. It was much closer this time, almost probing in its intensity, and clearly not coming from any bowhead whale on Earth. We both shared a look of pure trepidation, but as the call continued its strange beauty, it seemed to allay our fears. This was not aggressive behaviour. It was the curiosity of an animal much more intelligent than any average fish. An animal that wanted to know more about us. The issue, of course, was that while we knew this was no bowhead, it was similar enough that it could be passed off as one, and thus any evidence ignored. I had no doubt that it would even be written off as a hoax, tarnishing our reputations in the process. It was slightly maddening to have such a clear audio callback recording and to know that it just wasn't enough. We needed something more. I saw my chance maybe half an hour later. Way down in the water column, slowly rising off the bottom, and somewhere off to our starboard side, a massive arch appeared on the sonar screen. This thing was gigantic, far larger than what we saw in South Africa. My breath caught in my lungs at the sight of the impression it left on the sounder. Unlike the previous encounter all those years ago, this was rising lazily, as though totally unflustered by the vessel it surely knew was somewhere above it. It was a totally different approach to the one I'd suffered through previously, and I couldn't suppress the thrill of potential discovery as the scientist in me started to take charge again. The ROV had been in and out of the water, but at that point, it was idling quietly on a long tether about 100 meters below the ship, just floating there with one low-light camera running. We were only in a couple of kilometers of water, and the tether would easily allow the ROV to meet the thing as it rose from the deep. If I was very lucky, I might just be able to get a good look at it. My plan was interrupted by Callum, who entered the lab just as I was starting to take the ROV down. With the sun maybe an hour away, he had woken early to start going over the night's recordings. He frowned when he saw that most of the sound had been turned off. "What's going on? Why aren't we broadcasting?" My eyes flicked to the sounder, caught up in piloting the ROV as silently as possible. Long story. Short version, there's an animal under the boat right now. It's interested in the coda, and we're trying to get footage of it before it spooks. I expected Cal to be interested at the very least. What I didn't expect was the look of sheer rage and insanity that contorted his face as he rounded on me.
"So why the fuck are we not broadcasting?"
His voice was horrible, emanating the madness of a man you might expect to meet in a dark alleyway at 2 a.m. I wanted to stand up and deal with him right then and there, but I was busy trying to sneak up on a gargantuan beast from the bottom of the sea. So I responded as calmly as I could, while still letting him know he was way out of line. "We are. How do you suppose it would be interested in the coda if we were not broadcasting a coda for it to be interested in, Callum?" My sarcasm, though, fell on deaf ears. "Who gives a shit about the coda, Alan? We should be pumping this noise out as loud as we can. We need a reaction, not a mild passing interest." I was getting pissed now. "Well, Callum, the big scary leviathan currently moving up the water column certainly seems to be interested in the coda. All we got when we were spamming random sounds was something that sounded very much like a territorial threat. And I for one am not keen to provoke another aggressive act." I fixed him with a glare. "I'm sure I don't need to remind you who invited whom on their scientific expedition, Doctor." I'm not sure if it was the pointed jab at his fall from grace, or if he just snapped. But before I knew what was happening, Callum had pushed Lucy out of the way, flicked on the idle hydrophones, and started blasting the cacophony out around us once more. My heart sank, terror sitting leaden in its place. Right on cue, the aspid below us stopped dead in the water column, going completely silent. Then, the ship started to vibrate again, but much more violently, as unimaginable tons of angry animal started voicing its displeasure at the harsh concert now filling the water. Lucy pointed out the window into the brightening pre-dawn, her face a mask of horror. Outside, the sea was seething, like a cup of water sitting on a speaker. The sheer power of those vocalizations hit me, reverberating through my lungs. Even if this latest attack was too low for us to really hear, it was still tangible and dangerous. Callum seemed oblivious to the danger, staring intently at the sonar echo hanging motionless on the screen. "Come on, you bastard!" I took advantage of his fixation and I shoved him hard, sending him tumbling into the bulkhead and away from the computers. As he sprawled to the floor, I shut off the recordings and I ripped the terminal off the desk, ensuring that he couldn't get them going again. He screamed something at me, but I wasn't listening. Instead, I was straining to notice any change in the subsonic rumble. Anything that might indicate the creature was backing off. What I picked up was something new. Something that sent an icy jolt of fear down my spine. While the rumble seemed to have stopped, it had been replaced with a soft, high-pitched whine, like an old-fashioned camera flash winding up. For the briefest of moments, I was absolutely convinced that it was the beginning of a sonic attack, like the one that had nearly killed me off Cape Town. But it never really increased, and I quickly realized that was stupid. Organic sounds don't need a warming up. What I did notice, though, was the arch on the sounder was rising again. That whining sound was a constant, and the thing seemed to be heading for the surface. Callum and Lucy were staring slack-jawed at the sonar screen, but I focused the camera feed from the ROV. It had been positioned quite close to where the aspid was, and I hoped to at least get a glimpse before I died. Within seconds, I was looking at a dark wall of flesh that sent the ROV spinning before the screen went dark as the tether was severed and the ROV was lost. It had been about 800 meters down when the thing roared past, so I instinctively braced for impact, thinking that the aspid had just had enough and decided to go on the offensive. The impact came, but it was not the fatal collision I was expecting. It still hit hard, knocking me to the floor and snapping my arm with a sharp crack and a hot flash of agony. But I'd thought that a creature of that size would break the back of the ship and send us all plummeting to the bottom. As it was, we would quickly discover that the damage to the rudder and the propeller shaft was considerable, and slow leaks had breached the hull in several places. Once again, an encounter with one of these things had left us bruised and battered on the open ocean. I believe we were incredibly lucky. Sometimes, the big bulls of several whale species will ram ships in an attempt to push them out of their space, but they hold back so as not to cripple themselves. I believe that's probably what happened off of Perth. We eventually pissed off an aspid just enough to make it want to give us a nudge out of its territory. I couldn't get past the fact that I had encountered one of these things twice, and both times I had barely escaped with my life. Laying at home with my arm in a cast, several days later, I decided that enough was enough. It was way too dangerous to get close to these things, and there was no guarantee I would survive a third time. Callum made an attempt to apologize and make things right, but I couldn't bring myself to speak to him. He had put everyone at risk, so I told him he could have his obsession. I was done. I would have been happy to close the book on the aspids there and then, to leave them as a dark and dangerous part of the world that we have no place invading anyway. Sadly, the story wasn't quite finished. Callum ensured that there would be one more tragic chapter before that could happen. It was the first week of April when I got the news that Callum was dead. Well, officially he was missing. It was believed that the ship he was on struck a mass of ice just below the water and went down. There were other vessels combing the area, but I knew straight away it was a hopeless search. After the events off WA, Callum emailed me again, saying he had a solid lead around Deception Island, near Antarctica. The area is well known to internet conspiracy theorists because of a supposed sea monster that appeared on Google Maps satellite images a while ago. Callum knew about this, obviously, but he never thought it was connected until he heard the tales told by fishermen who frequented the area. The waters down there are the single most important Patagonian toothfish, aka Chilean sea bass, fishery on the planet, crisscrossed by thousands of kilometers of long lines. Fishermen, Callum said, had reported something taking line as they winched in their catch. This is not your ordinary fishing reel by any means. Colossal squid try and pick the fish off the hooks and are caught on these long lines surprisingly often. In fact, the scientific archetype for the species came to light in exactly this way, complete with hand-filmed YouTube video. The winches the ships use will drag a monster squid through the water and to the surface without even dropping a rotation. So taking line off them is a monumental ask. Callum thought that in the same way the squid liked to pick the toothfish off the line, maybe something was picking off the squid that got themselves trapped in the attempt. Something massive. He had begged me to go with him, but after the way he acted off Perth, and the fact that we had barely escaped once again, I stuck by the answer I had already given him. I was done with Aspids, and I was done with Callum. Of course, that didn't mean I wanted him dead. Once I heard he was missing, I did a bit of my own digging, despite what happened in WA. Callum had left Perth in a poor way. He had tried to get his hard evidence, our safety be damned. And I think he started to realise just how far down the rabbit hole he really was. The next contact anyone had with him was in Ushuaia, where he'd met a fishing vessel heading out for the start of the season. It's a long trip, and fishing is banned over the summer, so the ships start to trickle down to the fishing grounds as autumn sets in. Callum had apparently paid the crew quite a sum of money to take him and his equipment along for the ride. It seemed that he had claimed to be searching for colossal squid. In the midst of my quest for information, I received a phone call. On the other end of the line was a Chilean government official. I'd contacted several researchers working in the area, and it seemed that they had mentioned me when contacted by the same official seeking their help. The official, a man named Agustin, told me that the search had been called off and the ship was officially listed as being lost at sea. However, Callum had apparently enlisted a local benefactor with important connections, and the government had been pressured by the family to mount a search for the wreckage and discover what had happened to their son. This mysterious benefactor was apparently a complete wild child. One of those rich kids with more money than sense, and he had insisted on accompanying the mission and being part of the glory of discovery. Right away, it seemed odd to me that this fishing crew had agreed to be part of any of it. Running around at the whim of a spoiled rich kid and a mad scientist didn't strike me as something that many fishermen would be on board with. Then again, with the backlash against Patagonian toothfish as an ingredient due to its carbon footprint and the questionable sustainability of the resource, perhaps it was simply a case of money talking. Agustin was calling to ask me to accompany the search for the wreck. At the time, it seemed strange. I'm a biologist, not a salvage expert. I've seen wrecks, sure, but I struggled to see how I could be of any use to the investigation. But Agustin assured me that he had use for my expertise in piloting deep water vehicles. The stretch of water they believed the ship lay in was violent and required a high level of experience flying a sub. My relationship with Callum meant that he had called me first. I knew there was something he wasn't telling me, but I felt like it probably had to do with the rich kid, and my need for closure overrode those concerns. Callum might have lost his way, but we'd been best mates for 20 years, and I couldn't let his life and his achievements just fade away in a bleak and unforgiving corner of the world. Despite my fear and my uncertainty about Agustin's motives, there was only ever going to be one answer. The trip out to Ushuaia was arduous, with flights and stopovers lasting the better part of 4 days. I used my downtime to read all the reports Augustin sent me, to try and form a clearer picture of what Callum had been up to. According to the information Augustin had, Cal had paid an obscene amount of money to the captain of a large fishing vessel to take him out for the whole season. He had outfitted the ship with whatever equipment he could get his hands on. A small ROV, underwater cameras, hydrophones. He'd gone as far as he could towards turning a trawler into a scientific vessel. But once again, the money must have been desperately needed for the captain to allow that. They had set sail from Ushuaia before sheltering at Deception Island for a few days. After that, they had been spotted by other vessels a handful of times before vanishing entirely somewhere to the east of the island. Ushuaia is, quite literally, at the end of the earth. The last stop on the road to Antarctica. It is as beautiful as it is remote, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and frigid fjords. The place is simultaneously bleak and breathtaking. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to appreciate the town itself, because as soon as I landed, I was whisked over to the port and bundled onto a Chilean Navy vessel. Being on a Navy vessel set all sorts of alarm bells ringing. Even though it was only a research vessel, the fact that the Navy were involved filled me with a sense of unease. Still, I must admit that there was a huge sense of relief mixed up in all that suspicion. We were going to be sailing some of the most dangerous waters on the planet, so having naval support definitely made me feel more comfortable. The vessel itself was utilitarian, but very functional, and the submarine sitting on the stern deck was a state-of-the-art model. I was escorted through the crew areas, where stern-looking men and women paid absolutely no attention to the random scientist who had been dropped in their midst, eventually arriving in a dim, windowless room lit by old yellow light globes. The benches were crowded with modern scientific equipment, creating a jarring contrast to the aging vessel around us. As it turned out, Agustin Campos was a high-ranking official in the Chilean Defense Department. He was a surprisingly jovial little man with a quick smile, and he immediately assured me that the involvement of the Navy was simply out of necessity.
The sea in this area, as you know, is lethal. There are not so many vessels capable of navigating the area, and even fewer at short notice. Given that a Chilean citizen of great standing has died in this tragedy, we felt it appropriate to begin the search as soon as practical. This vessel may be old, but she has sailed these waters for many years, and she was available for a quick reassignment.
My suspicion faltered considerably in the presence of Agustin. This was a remote part of the world, wild and savage, and it made sense that the Navy of either Chile or Argentina would be the go-to marine organizations. Ushuaia is, in fact, in Argentina, but because it's the final port before the wild Southern Ocean, it's practically a world unto itself, and it functions as the staging point for anyone and everyone heading south of the Horn. Because of the twisting and turning passage out of Ushuaia and the high chance of overnight storms, the captain was reluctant to sail until morning. The channels out of the port were narrow, and moving a large vessel through them in zero visibility with the wind howling was a dangerous proposition. That meant a night on board while the storms passed, sheltered as we were by the islands to the south. Agustin showed me to my quarters, one of the researchers' racks that were small and sparse, but comfortable enough and much more private than the crew racks. And he told me that the captain had requested a meeting with myself and a couple of the guests over dinner in a couple of hours. That gave me enough time to catch a little sleep. I've always been an ordinary traveller, and almost 4 days on the road had utterly exhausted me. I think I honestly might have slept on a pile of barbed wire at that point. The captain entertained Agustin, myself, and 3 other guests in a small but well-decorated dining room just astern of his own quarters. He was a friendly man, but very military in his disposition, and I wasn't sure he would even know what the word imagination meant. Agustin reaffirmed my initial read, overtaking the table with his vivacious personality and infectious laugh. We were joined at the table by Marco, Charlotte, and Vasily. Marco was an engineer of some sort, who was softly spoken and gave off a very gentle vibe. Charlotte was a bit of a mystery. She claimed to be a contractor working for the Department of Defense, although her role was never really clear. Vasily, however, made his role very clear, along with the rest of his personality. He was our accident and salvage expert, and he was grumpy, loud, and incredibly outspoken. That being said, he was certainly not rude over the course of the meal, freely sharing his own jokes and his own experiences. On the whole, it was one of the better introductions I've ever had. Eventually, though, discussion turned away from introductions and towards our larger purpose. Try as I might, I couldn't get any information about the mysterious benefactor Callum had fallen in with. I did get a lot of incidental information about the disappearance itself, though. While still active on the airwaves, the ship had reported normal operations and normal catch rates. The ship had vanished in relatively calm seas, which was the major reason Agustin hypothesized that they had hit a barely submerged iceberg. Not only could the ice tear the hull out of the vessel, a large piece could roll the boat with its buoyancy. The latter scenario might explain why there had never been an SOS sent from the stricken vessel. Of course, I had theories of my own, ones I couldn't share. It was still quite early when I realized that I just couldn't stay awake. Days of travel had caught up with me, and I had to excuse myself with profuse apologies. Thankfully, my companions were all very understanding. The captain had an enlisted man escort me back to my cabin, and I was out before I could even get undressed. We were clearly underway by the time I awoke the next morning. Cold blue water sliding past the tiny porthole beside my bed. It was obvious we had yet to reach the open sea. The dark water outside was far too tranquil for that. Craning my neck, I saw the breathtaking peaks of the end of the world, shrouded in ethereal clouds and capped white with snow. By the time I'd showered quickly and dressed, though, the deck was a lot less stable. Slid under my door was a note from Agustin, who assured me that I could sleep as long as I needed, but that if I was awake, my company would very much be appreciated in the chart room at 10:30. Looking at my watch, I saw that it was just before 10. Plenty of time to find my way around, maybe grab some breakfast. We had been given full run of the officers' mess, so I knew there would be at least something to get me going for the day. As it turned out, I didn't even have to find my way. There was a young woman in uniform standing outside my door. "Good morning, Doctor," she smiled. "I wish I could sleep as well as you in such a noisy place." I stared at her for a moment, still a little foggy. Have you been standing here all morning?" She smiled again. "Why, yes. I am your guide, Amelia. I have been here since approximately 0700. But don't worry, I volunteered. It's still far better than the night watch." She smirked knowingly. "So, where would you like to go?" "I need coffee and something to eat, or I might actually die." "Officer's mess?" Amelia laughed. "I could use a coffee myself, and with you, I'm allowed to use the officer's mess too. Come, follow me." She led me through the narrow, winding corridors of the ship, past crew members scurrying about their daily business. I was glad for her help. Halfway there, I had to admit to myself that I would never have found my way alone. Over a hot mug of barely passable coffee and a pile of toast, I got to know Amelia a little. She was relatively new to the Navy, having joined to show her old-fashioned family she could do it. Her assignment to the research vessel was one of choice. At her last posting, she had been offered several positions but chose this one because it was actually one of the vessels that spent the most time at sea. 10:30 rolled around, and I found myself being delivered to the chart room, where the captain and Augustin greeted me. The captain with a smile and a nod, Augustin with a joyous cry of, "Good morning, Doctor," and a clap of his hands. My new friends from dinner were there too, although Vasily looked decidedly green around the gills, and I had to assume that he was hungover, given the way he was inhaling Chilean red the previous night. The captain gestured me to a seat.
The area in which the vessel apparently went down is not so big in terms of the search. We have been involved in far greater searches than this. However, the problem for us this time is the water itself, the topography of the sea floor.
He used a laser pointer to circle an area on the chart.
This is the approximate area in which the ship went down. It is not commonly fished or traveled, and so we actually know very little about the ocean floor. What we do know is that the sea here is very rough, and ice can be encountered at unexpected times. It will make for slow sailing at the least, impeding our search.
I interjected here, apologizing for the interruption. "Sorry, Captain, but I may be able to shed some light on the sea floor in the area, at least at a basic level." He nodded, unperturbed. "Many years ago, I was involved in a hunt for colossal squid in this same area. We didn't do any mapping or anything like that, but we were looking at features." I pointed to the sea east of the island chain that included Deception. Deception Island and the other island in the group sit on top of a ridge, and that ridge continues east-northeast underwater all the way to Coronation Island. On the south side of the ridge is a sheer drop-off. It's not a trench, but there is deeper water at the base of the ridge, and it's a bit of a rise as you move south. Over the southern side of the rise, there's a deep basin that's connected to the really deep section of the Weddell Sea. Basically, the whole area is dotted with ridges, drop-offs and seamounts. Actually, as I recalled more about the sea floor, I couldn't help but think it was the perfect spot for an aspid. I kept that bit to myself though, as Augustin clapped his hands again.
Marvelous. That is exactly why I reached out to you, Doctor.
The captain too looked quite impressed.
That is very useful information. Thank you, Doctor. However, it confirms my fears. The vessel may have easily come to rest within a ravine or some other feature that will make it very difficult to discover.
The search was to be quite a simple affair. We would enter the general area and deploy side-scan sonar, running track lines and marking anything interesting for another pass. Because of the depth, the first pass would simply be a cursory glance. Potential targets would then be run over again with the fish swimming deeper to give us a clearer picture. It was more efficient to run the fish higher in the water column because it covered more ground that way, even if the images were less distinct. It was also safer. If you run the vehicle 100 meters off the bottom, you risk plowing into a seamount. Once we had a definite wreck, I would dive down in the sub to get imagery of any damage so we could determine what happened to the vessel. Until then, there wasn't much for any of us to do. And with several days of sailing ahead of us into the teeth of the Southern Ocean, there would be a lot of downtime. Worse, we were confined to a very small area of the ship. Although this made perfect sense for safety reasons, it meant that the immediate future for me would essentially be spent in my cabin or in the mess. I hadn't even thought to pack a good book. "4 days it took. The old Navy ship chugging through the steely grey swells like a metronome. The whole time we seemed to be sailing straight into a howling wind that whipped the crest off each wave into a weightless foam. I was worried that the ceaseless pounding of the heavy seas would mean that we couldn't put the towfish in the water at all. But it seems that the Navy are a little less precious about all that stuff. The minute we entered the search area, the skipper gave the order to drop the torpedo-shaped sonar device and start dragging. The bottom, as I had recalled, was a nightmare. Sitting in the lab, watching the ticker-tape scrolling of the sonar footage gave us a harsh view of the task at hand. Sharp, craggy rock formations, deep ravines and sheer drop-offs littered the seafloor, making our job that much more difficult. Coffee became a constant necessity, an almost life-giving fluid that robbed the monotonous expanse of the monitors of the power to put us to sleep. For the first day, we saw nothing unusual. I grabbed a few hours sleep from midnight until about 4 a.m. and returned to the tedium unrested and itching for something to happen. Nothing happened. While it was boring, that was a good thing for me in a way. The more time I put in early on, the more of an excuse I would have to catch up on rest as we got further into the search. Piloting a sub in harsh conditions is taxing, and the more time that passed without a result theoretically meant that we were closer to finding the wreck. I didn't even have to mention it, really. Vasily and Marco started pushing me to rest after the 3rd day, and I was not going to refuse. We had had a few re-investigations, but nothing of substance yet anyway. On the 5th day, though, we had our first abnormal encounter. Vasily called me into the lab to have a look at a signature that had appeared on the sonar and seemed to fit some of the dimensions of our target. The vessel was around 70 meters long, a true Southern Ocean longliner, and the sonar target was of a similar length. Looking at the image, I thought that had to be the trawler. Whatever was on there was a little under 70 meters long and clearly not the same density as the rock around it. At the depth we were running the sonar, it was impossible to perceive much detail, but the target looked good. However, Vasily wasn't so sure. While this object was the right length, it seemed too wide to be the vessel we were after, even after taking into account the possibility that it might be lying on its side. Still, we marked it and instructed the bridge to make another pass. On the second pass, the object was gone. There was no error. We confirmed the position several times, and we made passes fractionally to either side of the mark to account for any shift in our position caused by the conditions. The object was gone. Marco, Vasily, and Agustin seemed utterly perplexed. Maybe it was a fault with the sonar, or an error caused by the heaving of the ship itself. I knew it was nothing like that. I had known that the aspids were giants, but I felt abject horror at the sheer size of what we had just seen. The largest blue whale on record measured 108 feet, which equates to around 33 meters. This sonar target was astoundingly big, measuring between 64 and 68 meters. It was no wonder the trawler lay somewhere below us if Cal had run afoul of that animal. And we would be absolutely powerless against it as well. Only Amelia picked up on my reaction, and she waited until we were alone to ask me about it. I'm not sure why I told her about my encounters, but to her credit, she listened and didn't immediately presume I was insane. She seemed to be digesting the information. In my first year in the Navy, we were involved in rescuing a raft of fishermen way down in the polar waters. They were very lucky. We were already nearby on assignment. It still took us almost 36 hours to find them. Anyway, only one of the survivors was conscious. 2 had succumbed to the cold despite their suits. Although they did survive, but 3 had ruptured eardrums and damage to areas of their brain. I am no medical expert, so I cannot vouch for that. But I do remember that the conscious survivors said that their line had been snagged, and they had tried everything to free it, and that as they did so, there was a terrible sound, and their boat hit something and sank very quickly. She looked at me thoughtfully. Perhaps their boat did not hit something. Perhaps something hit their boat. I was shocked. Could there be, unwittingly, an official record of an aspid attack? Amelia shook her head. I don't think so. From memory, it was ruled that the ship hit a submerged iceberg and capsized very quickly. The report from the sailor of a strange and terrible sound was omitted from the official document. At that moment, Agustin entered the mess and shot me a look. I shivered. For the barest moment, the jovial man I had grown to know over the past fortnight or so was gone, replaced with a disdainful, goading look, like he was challenging me. It was gone in a flash, and his jovial smile returned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that look gave me. I was sure Agustin knew something about that sonar target. Ultimately, there was very little I could do about the aspid on the sonar. It was gone, and I supposed that no one would believe me anyway. Even if they did, I wasn't sure that it would be wise after the thing with Agustin. So I focused all my energy on the search for the longliner. Every day, we had 2 or 3 targets, and every day, they turned out to be nothing. Our search area might have been relatively small, but it was still a painstaking process etching sonar lines over the grid. Eventually, though, we did find it. The vessel was sitting upright in about 1,500 meters of water, just on the drop-off into the basin below the southern border of the Scotia Sea. It must have gone down fast. The better sonar image showed that the impact with the bottom had apparently crushed in a large section of the bow. It was a mess, honestly. I had to prepare to dive on it as soon as possible though, so I was running the sub through warm-up checks and so forth, while the others worked out the best approach. They would drop me in the right spot and give me my approach vectors, attempting to miss any rigging or debris that could tangle the sub. An issue like that could be fatal. The first dive was to be exploration, short and sweet. I would descend and approach the wreck, confirming its identity for certain before mapping and photographing the site from above. In days gone, this would have been an arduous task, but with new software and cameras, I could essentially do one slow pass over the wreck from bow to stern and get most of the information we needed. We couldn't spend hours on the bottom, so this approach allowed us to use high-def photos to pinpoint areas of interest that we could then investigate more closely on subsequent dives. As the world outside the sub window turned an ever darker blue, I couldn't help but think about what else could be down there with me. I had to put those thoughts aside though. There was nothing I could do about it, even if we weren't alone. My co-pilot was an officer called Simon, a trainee who could get us to the surface if needed, but would really leave the job to me otherwise. We made small talk as we descended, but the thick silence of the sea soon smothered us with an oppressive sense of apprehension. The bottom approached out of the gloom, an otherworldly expanse of rock and silt. Orienting the sub towards the wreck, I crawled forward as slowly as I could. Rigging might show up on the side scan, but it might not. Before long, the ship materialized in the lights. We were coming at it on an angle, with the stern filling our field of view. I swung slowly to the left, knowing that I was looking at the tomb of a lifelong friend. It was more emotional than I had expected, and I paused for a moment, allowing myself a silent moment to grieve. All of that was pushed from my mind the moment I saw the front of the ship. Simon's brow furrowed, and he swore in Spanish while my breath caught in my throat. Just forward of the superstructure, the bow ended in a twisted mess. We had thought, from way above, that the damage must have been done upon impact with the bottom. I'm a biologist, but I've seen my share of wrecks. You kind of need to be a multi-purpose employee when you're an experienced sub-pilot. Impact looks like impact, regardless of whether it's above or below the waves. This? It just didn't look like impact. The steel of the bow end of the ship was pinched inward where the vessel had been truncated. That doesn't happen in an impact event. such as a collision with another vessel or the sea floor. I needed to confirm with Vasily, but I had seen steel like that before. My father owned a cattle station, and sometimes when he ran a pipe through the old guillotine that was too soft or too thin, it compressed like that. With growing horror, I realized that the bow of the ship looked like it had been run through a gigantic guillotine, and very neatly and very cleanly severed. We returned to the surface in utter silence. Simon was puzzled, but I think he had managed to convince himself that what we had seen was quite normal. As for me, I was shaking. The lab on board the ship was hushed as Marco and Vasily analysed the images. Marco was suggesting that there must have been a collision with another vessel, but Vasily was puzzled by the damage.
It looks different to a collision, Marco. See the edges? In a collision, these crush lines all go the same way. Here, the lines go towards each other. Doctor, what do you think? You have been down there.
I thought very carefully about what I should say, and I decided a kernel of truth couldn't hurt. Honestly, I have no idea. It almost looks like it's been severed or crushed by something. Beyond that, all I know is I need a shower. Let me know what you need for the next dive. I must have showered for at least 20 minutes, my stomach churning and my mind hammering along like a train. I was completely certain that the fishing vessel and Callum had been attacked by the thing they were seeking. The same thing, I believed, that we had seen briefly on the side scan sonar. It was still in the area, and we had no idea why it had attacked the wrecked longliner. And all I could think about was how much water was underneath me at that moment. It gave me pins and needles. As I dressed, there was a knock on my cabin door. On the other side stood Agustin, wearing a smile that somehow failed to extend to his eyes. I was quickly beginning to distrust him, but I allowed him to come in anyway.
Just wanted to check that you're okay, Doctor.
He began effusively.
The folks in the lab said you retired here immediately after your dive, and I understand that diving the depths can be hard on a person.
Thanks, mate, but I'm all good. I mustered a half smile. Subs like that are just really tight. I needed a bit of a hot shower to work the kinks out. Agustin nodded.
I certainly cannot imagine being in one myself. These ships are almost too claustrophobic for me. Rest up, Doctor. Have a meal and a warm drink. Perhaps catch some sleep. Vasily has already indicated that he will need another dive as soon as is safe. But I've told him that we will wait until you are ready.
That last sentence was said in a smug, knowing manner. Or maybe it was just my growing mistrust. I did my best to act as though I hadn't noticed. Thanks. I could definitely use something to eat. I'll get the preparations underway once I've eaten. It'll take a few hours at least to get everything ready again, so that'll give me around 4 or 5 hours sleep, and we'll go as soon as possible. He smiled again, but his eyes remained calculating and cold.
Very good, Doctor. I will be in the lab if you need anything at all.
I dived that wreck 4 times, photographing and videoing various sections ad nauseum. Vasily couldn't quite work out exactly what had happened, but in our conversations he agreed with my assessment. It certainly looked like the bow section of the vessel had been crushed off, but he couldn't work out how or why that might happen. I was desperate to tell him what Callum was really doing down here. But I needed more than just my own stories, and I was at a loss as to how I could get it. I never imagined that it might come to me. We were operating around the clock, with little sense of day or night, especially for those of us going down to the bottom. I was basically sleeping in 6-hour shifts, ready to dive whenever it was required. Being a military operation, there was no wiggle room. Agustin wanted this done and dusted as soon as it could be. The last dive of the trip started out not too long past midnight, with a freezing wind cutting through a surprisingly calm evening. The dive was utterly routine to begin with, the sub slowly sinking into the wreck site. Vasily wanted some samples of the steel at the bow brought back so he could analyze them for intrusive elements, perhaps helping to decide what had caused the damage. It always took longer to get samples. The tools on the sub were very delicate and they took a slow hand, as did navigating close to the wreck to use them. Because of that, we had planned to spend several hours down below, cutting samples and taking close-up shots of the damage. As we approached the wreck, I noticed that the silt had been disturbed. I didn't think anything of it. The currents in the area were prone to sudden changes, and at the time I was just irritated at the drop in visibility. I powered up the stronger lights and set about getting closer to the wreck. It was over an hour into the dive when the sediment finally settled again and the water cleared enough that I could take macro shots. I had spent the time getting some of the samples, knowing that the water clarity was crucial to the photos Vasily needed. And with that done, I snapped the shots I needed of the front of the ship and I moved out from the wreck. Swinging around, I thought I saw a shadow off in the distance and I instantly froze. Nothing moved though, so I pulled around the other side of the wreck to get shots of the edge of the torn hull. As I did, something definitely moved beyond the other side of the shattered vessel, just outside the reach of the light. By now, I had convinced myself that the shadow I saw was probably a large squid, or maybe a sleeper shark, if it was anything at all. Far too quickly, it became apparent that I was very wrong. There was a clear and obvious movement in the water, and a cloud of silt off in the distance that caught the fading beams of light before a strong new current whipped it away. It all happened in an instant, and just like that, I was face to face with death itself. The creature was mammoth, dwarfing the sub. It moved with surprising grace, barely disturbing the sediment as it crept past the edge of the light. Despite good water clarity and bright light, it was so large that we could barely see past the shoulder, leaving us with the impression of a creature that disappeared into the murk forever. Its head was striking, almost Chelonian, blunt and massive, and topped with a heavy, tapered crest that was clearly involved in producing such monumental sounds. I had expected an animal that relied so heavily on sound to be nearly blind, but the two huge eyes on either side of the head just below the crest spoke to excellent vision even in the dark of the abyss. The jaw was ancient and simple, opposing bone edges in place of teeth, but hinged with enormous muscles to generate immense bite force, and tipped with a vicious structure resembling a beak. They reminded me of a vast snapping turtle. There was no doubt that the bow of the fishing vessel had fallen prey to those vice-like jaws, cut clean through by unimaginable force. Within that cavernous mouth, I spotted something else. A bright blue glow emanated from between the jaws, and as the aspid shifted, I saw yet another surprise. Its tongue throbbed with bioluminescence. Yet another lure. Perhaps it used the glow to entice large squid species into those jaws. Or perhaps it served to mimic the bioluminescence of a big squid and reinforce the sonic lure. I'll probably never know. It was an incredible sight nonetheless. Behind the head, a series of craggy growths gave the appearance that the animal was made out of the rock itself. Useful camouflage for an ambush predator, even in the black of the ocean. When pinged with echolocation, it would appear no different to the bottom that it was hiding on. It balanced on two slender forelimbs that ended in these splayed claws, hooked for gripping prey. As large as it seemed to us, it was only twice the size of the animals it stalked. I figured the attack came via stunning with sound, followed by a massive killing bite, after which the aspid would tear chunks out of the carcass, much like a hawk, gripping it with its own talons. It looked squarely at the sub, clearly registering our presence as the source of the light. The complex light-detecting lenses in its eyes shone like vast discs against the mottled black skin. It came closer, quite gently, more curious than aggressive. I became aware of a soft chirping sound, like a cicada played over whale song. Unbelievably quiet, given it originated from the behemoth outside. After watching us for a moment, it let out a louder call. A clear note that resonated within the submarine like a bell. Then, effortlessly, it turned out of the light and moved off with a flick of an enormous saurian tail. Seeing an aspid in the flesh was simply awe-inspiring. A gargantuan predator from eons before we humans began to descend from the canopy. Terror and fascination mixed like napalm in my veins, firing my mind in 1,000 different directions. What genus was the animal? What family? Where had it evolved from? And how long ago? Did it have any living relatives? How had it evolved such a complex sonic ability? Deep-sea gigantism went some way to explaining its size, but why had it needed to be so large? Were there once bigger animals down here? Were there still? Simon was huddled in the back of the sub, as far away from the aspid as he could possibly get. A reflexive response to indescribable terror that made absolutely no difference. Little did we know then, however, that our encounter was a precursor to disaster. I cut the dive when I felt the aspid had enough time to clear the area. I couldn't operate down there with what had just transpired, as harmless as the encounter had thankfully turned out. We were about 500 meters down, taking it really slow, when I felt it. A throbbing vibration, like the engines of a ship, running steadily through the thick steel around me. I recognized that. The aspid never left. I quickly cut the lights, and I slowed our ascent even further, sure that we had somehow angered this behemoth of the deep. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized that it was somewhere above us, between the sub and the surface. Panicked, I picked up the radio.
Surface, cut all operations now.
There was a bemused reply from above.
Sorry? What? Have you lost it?
Had they not been watching the feeds?
For fuck's sake, I haven't got time to explain. Shut everything down.
Agustin jumped in.
What is the issue, Doctor?
I had no time to mess around.
I know you know what's down here, Agustin. You've known all along, and it's gearing up to attack right fucking now. Have you not been watching the cameras?
There was an interminable silence.
I asked the others to leave the room for security reasons, as I have done now. Tell me, Doctor, what is happening? There's no fucking time. You and I both know this thing sank the trawler. Whatever you guys are doing now has it in full threat display. Shut everything the fuck down. I will advise the captain. I suggest you stay below until the situation settles.
I'm not sure if they took too long, or if the aspid was simply angered by their presence. God knows enough ships have gone down in the area for a rogue Leviathan to be at least part of the cause. All I know is that, within moments of that final transmission, there came a sound unlike any I have ever heard. Greater even than the awful cry that set me on the path to where I sat just then. It was utterly hellish. A short burst like a horn, but immensely loud and tinged with a wailing edge. Moments later, came an even more terrifying sound. A deep thump and the scream of rending steel. We were sitting in twilight. Not deep enough to be in total darkness, but deep enough for the light of day to have lost any power. A huge shadow fell over us, just seconds after what could only be impact with the ship, and I held my breath. But the shadow lifted as the creature moved off, leaving us unharmed and surrounded by the sounds of groaning metal. Something serious had happened to the ship, and though I tried desperately, I couldn't raise them on the radio. Then, the debris started raining down on us. There was no doubt in my mind the ship was in its death throes when that first clang rang out through the sub. Thankfully, the impact was small. Likely something thrown off the deck as the ship started going under. It signaled a greater danger though. If we were in the debris field, there was every chance that this sinking ship was about to drop directly on us, dragging us into the abyss with it. Every direction was a gamble, because I had no way of knowing exactly where I was in relation to the ship. So I picked a direction across the current, and I pushed everything I could out of the tiny engines. I prayed to any god that might for some reason be listening to the panicked rambling of a terrified scientist. The sub was buffeted by something big fallen past not far behind us, too small to be the ship itself, but big enough to send us spinning into the gloom. I pushed a bit further, but I had to come up eventually. The batteries were close to drained already, and I needed enough power to get us to the surface and keep the air scrubbers going. We popped up like a cork a little while later, the surprising calm of the night still in force in the dawn light. The ship was nowhere to be seen. Although, even if I had been wrong, a calm day in that part of the world still involves enough swell that we wouldn't have seen it from mere inches above the water. Simon was pretty much catatonic, uselessly jammed into the back of the sub like so much luggage. I had to reach around him to activate the emergency beacon. As I thought about our predicament, I must admit, I envied his oblivion a little. Our odds of survival were incredibly slim, bobbing along at water level in a sub that we couldn't open, because the second we did, we would flood and sink. Thankfully, we'd at least be warm, surrounded as we were by blankets to combat the chill of the deep sea. Submarine science is not particularly glamorous. Of course, we only had 2 bottles of water, so we would be warm once we died of thirst. I was as surprised as anyone when 2 incredibly awful days later, a ship loomed up beyond the foggy glass window of the sub and rescued us. Astoundingly, there had been 2 beacons. A handful of survivors from our vessel had managed to get into a raft before it went down. Even more astoundingly, my guide Emilia was among them. We met again when we were transferred to a Chilean Navy frigate for extraction. The crew had been rescued by a different vessel a day before Simon and I were found, their eyes hollow with shock as they made their way out of the frigate. Emilia hugged me, despite clearly broken bones, sobbing into my neck and words escaping her for that moment and quite a few after. It was not until we were safe on land that she spoke about what had happened. My message from below had sent Agustin into a panic, fleeing the lab and racing towards the bridge. I have absolutely no idea why he didn't just use the comms system, but it doesn't seem like it would have mattered. Emilia, not privy to my transmission, and thinking that there must be an issue with our new sub, ran out to the recovery deck to see if she could help. That decision probably saved her life, because as she flew out of the innards of the ship, that tremendous horn-like sound rang out, sending her crashing to the deck in agony. Then came the impact. Emilia, through tears of pure terror, described it as the worst thing she had ever felt. It was as though the ocean underneath the ship suddenly vanished, leaving it to smash into the bottom far below. She said that she was catapulted off the deck, slamming back down with a bone-breaking thump. After that, it was all a bit foggy. One of the deck crew must have bundled her into the raft, although she definitely recalled watching the broken vessel slip beneath the waves, its back shattered by the sheer brutality of the attack. There really wasn't much to say after all that. The sub was lost when we were rescued. Without gear to bring it aboard, the fishermen had held it at the surface long enough to get Simon and I out, and then cut it loose. It could have sunk their own vessel otherwise. The footage of the beast below was lost to the depths. For her part, Emilia simply told the officials that interviewed her she couldn't really remember what happened. Just a heavy impact before her injuries rendered her unconscious. I was far below the actual attack, and so it was easy for me to say that I had absolutely no idea what happened. Simon is apparently still not spoken, and I don't really know what the other survivors said. After I was spoken to a few times, I was allowed to fly home, and that was that for me. I did speak with Amelia later on, because I had to know if Agustin had known what was out there. She proved a very capable informant, but there was less to know than I had suspected. It turned out that Chileans knew something strange was happening in the deep, wild seas off both their own coast and Antarctica, but they didn't know what it was. Agustin, seemingly, had correctly conflated mine and Cal's experiences with what they had experienced themselves, presuming that the massive sonic predators we encountered were also the cause of the deaths and disappearances he was investigating. The sinking of the research vessel was put down to a fatal error. A collision with an iceberg the military claimed that they found in the area immediately after. I'm not sure if there was a second, less well-known verdict. I didn't even bother to ask. I don't suppose I'll ever know exactly why the Aspid attacked either vessel. Despite the fishing fleets, the Southern Ocean is easily one of the least travelled oceans on the planet. Maybe this animal was simply wilder than those living underneath the congested shipping lanes of other parts. Maybe it was just a really aggressive one. Maybe it was guarding something. Territory or hunting grounds. Or a nest. There are hundreds of reasons an animal might attack, and even more when it's an animal that we know nothing about. I needed to have something to cling onto though. So I finally settled on the idea that maybe this animal simply knew what humans were capable of. Creatures in the deep sea can live for much longer than you might think. Sleeper sharks, for example, are thought to be the longest-lived vertebrates on the planet, with a lifespan potentially reaching over 500 years. Deception Island and the waters surrounding it were centrally important to the whaling industry for a very long time. It's completely conceivable that the animal that attacked the vessels in the Antarctic remembered similar vessels from hundreds of years ago. Vessels that violated its territory and hunted its food source near extinction. If that were the case, it would have a short fuse for any similar craft entering the area and hanging about for too long. The idea that these animals are long-lived and intelligent enough to learn about us and remember our indiscretions terrifies me. The oceans are increasingly congested and polluted as a result of our actions. And if I'm right, it's simply a matter of time before this entire species turns on us. If that happens, the deep oceans will be completely off limits, ruled from far below by beasts the size of the biblical Leviathan and much deadlier. I think that might be inevitable. See, the thing is, I could flood the internet with sound recordings and scream that these things exist until my throat was raw, and no one would believe me. The sounds would be other animals, or ice quakes, or outright hoaxes, and I'd be a man driven over the edge by the stress of the accident I survived, just like Callum. So, if the aspect of deception really was attacking ships because it remembered them from the days when whalers slaughtered its prey and challenged it for food, then I think we're probably doomed to lose the oceans in the end. We cannot prepare for something, we cannot change our ways if we don't accept that it's coming. I have retired since deception. moving to a small coastal New South Wales town not too far from where I grew up. That might seem absurd, living by the sea after all I've been through, on and under it. But I figure the aspids don't really seem to travel onto the shelf. I've put out a lure of my own too, searching for anything that could suggest aspid activity. Just a week ago, a small fishing vessel was found drifting over the New Hebrides Trench with bodies on board. As it stands, there has been a marked increase in serious events, and the calls of the aspids seem to be resounding through the depths with alarming regularity. They just aren't afraid of us anymore. Every night, I sit on the front deck and I stare out at the dark ocean, just wondering how long it's going to be before the monsters far beneath the waves make the move from my nightmares into the nightmares of humanity as a whole.